The briefing room fell silent when Colonel Marcus Thorne's hand closed around Captain Vesper Calloway's braid. Not a gentle touch, not accidental. A deliberate fist wrapped in dark hair, yanking her head back until her throat was exposed to the fluorescent lights overhead. 37 pilots witnessed it. 37 pairs of eyes watched as the most decorated officer at Nellis Air Force Base crossed a line everyone knew existed but few dared acknowledge. What happened next would become legend, whispered in ready rooms from Nevada to Okinawa, debated in officer clubs and congressional hearings, analyzed frame by frame in security footage that somehow leaked despite every classification stamp the Pentagon could apply. But the moment itself, that singular breath between violation and consequence, belonged only to those who were there. Vesper didn't scream, didn't struggle. Her hands, calloused from years gripping control sticks through combat maneuvers that would have killed lesser pilots, remained perfectly still at her sides. Her jaw set with the kind of calm that comes not from training but from something deeper, something forged in circumstances that would later emerge like fragments of shrapnel working their way to the surface. In that frozen instant, with her neck arched and her eyes fixed on the water-stained ceiling tiles, she looked almost peaceful. Almost. Briefing had started routinely enough. Pre-dawn darkness still blanketing the tarmac outside, coffee burning in styrofoam cups, the usual mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline that defined military aviation. They were going over the day's training sorties, red flag exercises that would pit F-35 Lightning IIs against aggressor squadrons flying Russian tactics. Standard stuff. The kind of drill Vesper could have briefed in her sleep, which was fortunate because she'd gotten maybe 3 hours of it. She'd been running night operations for 72 hours straight, testing modified avionics packages that kept failing at altitude, troubleshooting problems that engineers insisted were impossible. Colonel Thorne had other concerns. He stood at the front of the room, pointer in hand, discussing formation discipline with the subtle condescension of someone who'd stopped flying desks ago but still wore his wings like they meant something. When Vesper raised her hand to question the fuel calculations, numbers that were objectively wrong, dangerously wrong, he'd waved her off. When she persisted, citing specific load data from her previous mission, his face had darkened. When she stood, tablet in hand with the actual figures displayed, he'd moved. Fast, faster than a man his age should move. Across the room in 4 strides, his hand already reaching, already grabbing. The sound her braid made when it pulled taut against her scalp was small, almost nothing. But in that silent room, it echoed like a rifle crack. Nobody moved. Not the young lieutenants fresh from training. Not the seasoned majors who'd flown combat missions over 3 different countries. Nobody. Vesper's eyes finally dropped from the ceiling, found the colonel's face, and what he saw there made him let go, made him step back, made him suddenly aware that he'd miscalculated in a way that couldn't be undone. Her expression held no anger, no fear, just a terrible, absolute certainty. The look of someone who'd already survived worse than anything he could imagine, and who'd documented every second of this encounter in the perfect tactical memory that made her one of the finest pilots the Air Force had ever tried to break. She didn't speak, didn't need to. She simply straightened, adjusted her flight suit with mechanical precision, collected her tablet from where it had fallen and walked toward the door. Her boots made no sound on the linoleum. 37 people watched her go. The colonel's hand still hung in the air where her hair had been, trembling slightly as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd just done. The door clicked shut. Somewhere in the distance, jet engines began their morning warm-up cycle. The sun hadn't risen yet, but something had irrevocably shifted at Nellis Air Force Base. By the time Vesper reached her locker, her phone was already buzzing. By the time she changed into her flight gear, 3 separate commanding officers were being woken with urgent calls. By the time she walked to her aircraft, and with Revenant stenciled below the canopy in letters that seemed darker than regulation allowed, the base JAG office was already preparing files that would eventually fill 17 boxes. But none of that mattered yet. What mattered was the mission. What mattered was the sky waiting above the Nevada desert, that vast empty space where rank meant nothing and physics were the only authority that counted. What mattered was the feel of the throttle under her palm, the helmet settling over her head, the pre-flight checklist that she ran with the same meticulous attention she gave everything. Flying was the only truth she'd ever fully trusted. The only place where her competence couldn't be questioned, because the aircraft didn't care about gender or politics or colonels, who grabbed things that didn't belong to them. The crew chief who helped her strap in was a master sergeant named Rivera who'd been turning wrenches since before Vesper was born. He didn't mention the briefing. Didn't need to. The speed with which the base Grapevine operated exceeded any classified communication system the military possessed. He just checked her connections with extra care, his weathered hands moving over buckles and oxygen lines, with the tenderness of someone ensuring a valued asset was properly protected. When he met her eyes through the visor, he gave a single nod. Solidarity without words. Vesper returned it, began her systems check. The F-35's displays glowed to life around her, a cockpit that looked more like a video game than any aircraft her father might have flown. Except this was no game. Every switch, every indicator, every line of code represented millions of dollars and decades of engineering. She'd memorized every system, every backup, every failure mode. Had to. Women in fighter cockpits still carried the burden of proving themselves every single day, and she'd learned early that competence wasn't enough. You had to be flawless. Tower clearance came through. Her wingman for the morning was Captain Marcus Chen, call sign Cypher, a solid pilot who'd never questioned her abilities or her presence. They'd flown together enough that words were mostly unnecessary. The kind of trust that develops when you've relied on someone to keep enemy radar off your six while you're inverted at Mach 1.3 with hostile fighters somewhere in the sun above you. Radio discipline was clean, professional, exactly as it should be. Revenant, you're cleared for taxi runway 21. Winds light and variable. Copy Tower taxiing 21. Her voice steady, giving nothing away. The colonel would have expected tears maybe, outrage. Some emotional response that confirmed whatever assumptions had led him to put hands on her in the first place. Instead, she was doing her job, flying her aircraft, being exactly what she'd always been, a weapon the Air Force had spent millions to forge and apparently didn't quite know what to do with. The throttle pushed forward. 73,000 pounds of thrust pressed her back into the seat. The runway disappeared beneath her nose. The desert fell away. And in that moment of transition between earth and sky, Vesper Calloway felt something that had been coiled tight in her chest begin to ease. Up here, nobody could grab her. Up here, competence was measurable, absolute, inarguable. The physics didn't care about politics. The morning exercise was supposed to be simple. Her flight of 4 against a pair of aggressor F-16s flying Soviet doctrine. Standard intercept scenarios, building blocks for the more complex operations that would come later in the week. She was leading the element, which meant the other 3 pilots were her responsibility. Chen on her wing, 2 younger pilots in the trail element, both men, both watching to see how the woman who'd been publicly humiliated an hour ago would perform under pressure. Whether she'd be distracted, whether she'd make mistakes that would validate every quiet doubt about female fighter pilots that still circulated in certain circles. They were disappointed. Vesper flew with mechanical perfection. Her intercept geometries were textbook, her communication crisp and clear. When the aggressors tried to exploit a gap in the formation, she'd anticipated it by 15 seconds, repositioning her element to convert their attack into a defensive scramble. By the time the exercise ended, the aggressor lead was on the radio offering grudging compliments in the coded language that fighter pilots used when they didn't want to seem too impressed. Decent BFM up there, Revenant. You've done this before. Once or twice, she replied, and if there was any edge in her voice, the radio compression filtered it out. Professional to the last. She brought her flight home with the same precision she'd launched with, each aircraft kissing the runway exactly where it should, exactly when it should. But when she climbed out of the cockpit, she found a full bird colonel waiting. Not Thorne. Colonel Sarah Whitmore, the base vice commander, a woman with 30 years of service and a reputation for zero tolerance of anything that threatened good order and discipline. Her face was unreadable behind aviator sunglasses, but her presence at the flight line was message enough. Officers of her rank didn't typically meet individual pilots after routine training sorties. "Captain Calloway, my office, 1 hour." "Yes, ma'am." Whitmore turned to leave, then paused, looked back. "That was clean flying up there, very clean." "Thank you, ma'am." The words hung in the desert heat. Vesper watched the colonel walk away, already knowing that the real battle was just beginning. The flying part was easy. Combat was easy. You could train for combat, prepare for combat, understand combat through study and simulation and hard-earned experience. But this, institutional politics, gender dynamics, the labyrinth of military justice that could either vindicate or destroy her depending on whose version of events the system chose to believe. This was the fight she'd been avoiding her entire career. The other pilots kept their distance as she walked to debriefing. Not hostility exactly, more like uncertainty. Nobody knew quite how to handle what had happened. The ones who sympathized didn't want to seem weak by association. The ones who thought she'd overreacted didn't want to be called out. So they gave her space, and in that space, Vesper found herself remembering another time, another place, when silence had been her only ally. She'd been 14 when her father disappeared. Air Force test pilot assigned to a program so classified she still didn't know its real name. One day he was there, arguing with her mother about dinner plans and whether Vesper was old enough to learn aerobatics. The next day, gone. The official story changed 3 times in as many weeks. Training accident, operational incident, administrative reassignment. Her mother stopped asking questions after men in suits made it clear that asking questions was not in the family's best interest. Vesper had learned then that the institution would protect itself first, always, and the people who served it were expendable variables in equations that never showed their work. She joined anyway, maybe because of that, maybe in spite of it, following her father into a sky that had swallowed him and refused to explain why. Colonel Whitmore's office was sterile in the way that senior officer spaces always were. Flags in the corners, plaques on the walls, photographs of aircraft and formations and change-of-command ceremonies. A career distilled into carefully framed moments that revealed nothing personal. The colonel sat behind her desk, fingers steepled, reading something on her computer screen that Vesper couldn't see. "Sit." Vesper sat. "I've reviewed the security footage from this morning's briefing." Whitmore's eyes finally lifted from the screen, gray eyes, hard as flint. "I've also spoken with 17 witnesses who were present. Would you like to tell me your version of events?" "I questioned fuel calculations that appeared incorrect, ma'am." Colonel Thorne disagreed. "The situation escalated." "Escalated is an interesting word choice." Whitmore leaned back. "From my perspective, Colonel Thorne committed assault in front of 36 witnesses. Your perspective?" The question was a trap. Vesper recognized it immediately. Too much outrage and she'd seem emotional, vindictive, unable to handle military culture. Too little and she'd appear weak, unwilling to stand up for herself, complicit in her own victimization. There was no right answer, only variations of wrong. "I prefer to focus on the mission, ma'am. The fuel calculations were incorrect. That's a safety issue that affects every pilot who flies based on that data." Whitmore's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or respect. Hard to tell. "The fuel calculations have been reviewed. You were correct. The mission brief has been updated." A pause. "That's not what we're here to discuss." "With respect, ma'am, that's exactly what we should be discussing. Everything else is noise." Noise that's already reached the Pentagon, Captain. Noise that's going to get louder before it gets quieter. The question is whether you want to be part of that conversation or try to fly above it. I'm a pilot, ma'am. Flying above things is what I do. A smile flickered across Whitmore's face. Brief, gone almost before it registered. Colonel Thorne has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. You'll need to provide a formal statement to JAG. They'll walk you through the process. You'll also need to decide whether you want to pursue charges. Vesper said nothing. Knew that anything she said now would be recorded, analyzed, used to build narratives she couldn't control. The institution was protecting itself, yes, but maybe, it was also protecting her. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. You're dismissed, but Captain, Whitmore's voice stopped her at the door. That call sign, Revenant, you chose it or was it assigned? I chose it, ma'am. Good choice. Whitmore returned to her computer screen, conversation over. But as Vesper left, she thought she heard the colonel mutter something that sounded like they should have known better. The afternoon briefings were subdued. Word had spread through the base with the efficiency of a weapons system designed for maximum information dispersal. Colonel Thorne gone. Captain Calloway flying. Investigation underway. The details varied depending on who was telling the story, but the core facts remained consistent enough. By evening, pilots were choosing sides even if they didn't realize they were doing it. Some thought she should have handled it differently. Some thought Thorne was a dinosaur whose time was overdue. Most just wanted the whole thing to go away so they could get back to flying without the distraction of gender politics infecting their squadrons. Vesper ignored all of it. She had a night sortie scheduled, continuation training on the targeting systems that were her specialty. The F-35's sensor fusion capabilities were the most advanced ever fitted to a fighter aircraft, but they required constant practice to exploit fully. Most pilots were content to master the basics. Vesper had gone deeper, learning the software architecture, the algorithms, the ways the system could be pushed beyond its nominal specifications. It was part of what made her valuable, part of what made her difficult to dismiss, even when the institution wanted to. Her night flight went as smoothly as the mornings, maybe smoother. Alone in the cockpit with just the instruments and the vast Nevada night outside her canopy, she felt something approaching peace. The stars overhead were the same stars her father had flown under. The physics that kept her aircraft aloft were the same physics that had carried every pilot who'd ever trusted their life to wings and thrust and the skill of their hands. Gender didn't matter here. Politics didn't matter. Only the mission. Only the flight. She landed 2 hours later, systems nominal, training objectives achieved. The crew chief who met her was different from the morning. A young airman whose name tag read Martinez, and whose eyes held the kind of curiosity people get when they're trying to square a legend with the reality standing in front of them. Vesper ignored the look, ran her post-flight checks, signed the forms, walked to debriefing alone. The JAG interview was scheduled for the next morning. She knew she should prepare, think through her statement, maybe consult with the Area Defense Council about her rights and options. Instead, she went to the base gym, changed into running gear, and put 10 miles on the track under lights that buzzed with insects and flickered occasionally, casting shadows that danced across the worn rubber surface. She ran until her legs burned and her lungs screamed, and the thoughts in her head quieted to something manageable. By the time she made it back to her quarters, a small room in the bachelor officer housing that held little more than a bed, a desk, and a footlocker with everything she owned, it was past midnight. She should have slept. Instead, she sat at the desk and opened her laptop, found herself pulling up files she hadn't looked at in years, photographs of her father, flight records from his last assignment, the sparse documentation of his disappearance that the Air Force had eventually released after her mother's lawyer had applied enough pressure. There were gaps in the record, places where pages should have been but weren't, dates that didn't align with official timelines. Her father had been testing something at Area 51. That much was clear from the redacted documents. Something experimental, Something dangerous enough that, when it went wrong, the entire program was buried so deep that Vesper suspected it still didn't officially exist. She'd never learned what happened to him, whether he died in a crash, been killed in some classified accident, or something else entirely. The official death certificate listed training accident with a location redacted and a date that didn't match the last time she'd spoken to him. Her mother had eventually accepted the ambiguity, moved on, remarried. Vesper had joined the Air Force instead, driven by the kind of questions that had no answers but demanded asking anyway. And now she was here, at Nellie's, flying the most advanced fighter jets ever built, making the same kinds of flights her father had made, testing the same kinds of systems, pushing the same kinds of boundaries. The parallel wasn't lost on her. Neither was the risk. The Air Force didn't like people who asked difficult questions. It especially didn't like people who asked difficult questions while being female, competent, and unwilling to accept easy answers. The laptop screen glowed in the darkness. Outside, jets were still flying. Night operations continued around the clock at Nellie's, the sound of freedom that locals had learned to sleep through. Vesper closed the files, closed the laptop, lay back on her bunk still fully dressed and stared at the ceiling until sleep eventually came, fitful and haunted by dreams of hands grabbing, hair pulling, voices saying things she couldn't quite understand but knew were important. Morning came with the alarm she'd set for 500. The JAG office was expecting her at 700. She showered, dressed in her service dress uniform instead of her flight suit. Appearances mattered in these situations, and made her way across base as the sun was just starting to paint the mountains pink and gold. The JAG building was nondescript, designed to be overlooked, which was probably intentional. Military justice liked to operate quietly, away from the flight lines and hangars where the real work happened. Major Lisa Chen, no relation to her wingman, was the attorney assigned to her case. Mid-40s, precise in a way that suggested either engineering training or law school excellence, possibly both. She offered coffee that Vesper accepted, then spent 30 minutes explaining what would happen next. The process was Byzantine. Paperwork and statements and interviews and reviews. Weeks of it minimum, possibly months. The wheels of military justice turned slowly, grinding fine but grinding nonetheless. "The question you need to answer," Major Chen said finally, setting down her own coffee cup with a click that seemed too loud in the small office, "is what outcome you're hopping for, because there are options. Colonel Thorne could face anything from a letter of reprimand to court-martial, depending on how this unfolds. But each outcome requires different levels of your involvement, different amounts of your time and energy, and different amounts of exposure for you personally." Exposure. The defense will examine everything about you. Your record, your relationships, your fitness reports, any prior incidents that might suggest a pattern or bias, or anything that could muddy the waters. They'll look for ways to make this about you instead of about what Colonel Thorne did. It's not fair. It's not right. But it's how these things work. Vesper had expected this, didn't make it easier to hear. "What would you do if you were me?" Major Chen smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I'm not allowed to answer that, but I can tell you what I've seen happen in cases like this. Most of them settle quietly. The officer in question takes a letter of reprimand, maybe early retirement. The victim, the complainant, gets reassigned somewhere far away where they can rebuild their career without the stigma of having caused trouble. Everyone pretends it's justice and moves on. And if I don't want to move on, then it gets messy, really messy. Are you prepared for that?" The question hung between them. Outside, someone was mowing grass, the sound of the mower oddly soothing in its mundane normalcy. Vesper thought about her father, about questions that never got answered, about systems that protected themselves by grinding up the people who challenged them. She thought about every young female pilot who'd come after her, who'd face their own Colonel Thornes and have to decide whether to fight or flee. "Yes," she said finally, "I'm prepared." Major Chen nodded slowly, as if she'd expected nothing less. "Then let's get started. This is going to take a while." The statement took 3 hours. Every detail of the briefing, the confrontation, the moment his hand closed in her hair, what she'd been thinking, feeling, planning to do, whether she'd provoked him in any way, a question that made her jaw clench but that she answered anyway, because refusing to engage would be used against her later. Major Chen was thorough, professional, and relentless in a way that made Vesper grateful they were on the same side. By the time they finished, it was past noon. She'd missed lunch and her afternoon brief, had a dozen messages on her phone from the squadron asking about her flight status for tomorrow. The world kept turning even when your own was caught in administrative amber. She responded to the essential messages, ignored the rest, and headed to the flight line anyway. Not to fly, she wasn't on the schedule, but because being near the aircraft helped. Watching other pilots launch and recover, listening to the sound of engines and radio chatter, remembering why she'd chosen this life in the first place. Rivera was working on one of the F-35s, elbow deep in an access panel with the kind of focused concentration that good maintainers brought to their work. He glanced up when Vesper approached, didn't look surprised to see her. "Heard you're grounded pending the investigation," he said, returning to whatever he was adjusting inside the aircraft. "Heard wrong. I'm flying tomorrow morning." "Good." He pulled a wrench from his tool bag, applied it to something Vesper couldn't see. "Aircraft don't fix themselves and pilots who don't fly get rusty. We need you up there." The words were simple, straightforward, but coming from Rivera, they carried weight. He'd been at Nellie's longer than most of the pilots, had seen countless officers come and go, had learned to spot the ones who were genuine versus the ones who were just passing through on their way to desk jobs and promotions. If he said she was needed, he meant it. "Thanks, Chief." "Don't thank me, just keep flying like you did yesterday. That intercept sequence you ran, textbook perfect. The young guys need to see how it's done right." Vesper felt something loosen in her chest, validation from someone whose opinion actually mattered. Not a colonel protecting institutional interests or a lawyer managing legal exposure, but a master sergeant who knew aircraft and pilots and the difference between competence and mediocrity. It shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, but it did. She stayed on the flight line for another hour, watching sorties cycle through, listening to the radio traffic, letting the familiar rhythms of military aviation settle her mind. By the time she left, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that no camera could quite capture. Her father had loved desert sunsets, used to say they were the reward for surviving the day's heat and dust. She'd forgotten that until now. The BOQ was quiet when she returned. Most pilots were either flying at the club or catching what sleep they could between missions. Vesper's room felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in with the weight of everything that had happened and everything still to come. She changed out of her uniform, pulled on civilian clothes, jeans and a t-shirt from a Steely Dan concert she'd attended years ago, and headed out again. Not to the club where questions and awkward conversations waited. To the base chapel instead. She wasn't religious, hadn't been since her father disappeared, and no amount of prayer had brought him back or provided answers about what happened. But the chapel was quiet, open 24 hours, and blessedly empty at this hour. She sat in one of the pews near the back and let the silence wash over her. No engines, no radios, no voices demanding statements or explanations or decisions about whether to pursue charges against a man who'd assaulted her in front of witnesses. Just silence, and in that silence finally she let herself feel it, the anger, the violation, the exhaustion of being constantly on guard, constantly proving herself, constantly navigating a system that saw her gender before it saw her skills. She didn't cry, crying felt like surrender somehow, but she let the emotions surface, acknowledged them, then carefully packed them away again. Tomorrow she'd fly. That's what mattered. The chapel door opened. Vesper didn't turn, assuming it was the chaplain or maybe someone else seeking the same quiet refuge she'd found. But then a voice she recognized spoke from somewhere behind her. "Figured I might find you here." Captain Marcus Chen, her wingman. He moved up the aisle and slid into the pew beside her, careful to maintain respectful distance. Didn't ask if she wanted company. Just sat there, another soul seeking silence in a profession that rarely afforded it. They sat like that for several minutes before Chen finally spoke again. My sister went through something similar. Not military, she was in tech. Had a supervisor who thought being handsy was just part of the culture. She reported it. They investigated. Eventually fired the guy. But the whole experience destroyed her. She ended up leaving the industry entirely. Vesper listened but didn't respond. Didn't know what to say. Thing is, Chen continued, she told me later that the worst part wasn't the harassment itself. It was the way everyone else reacted. How people took sides, made it about politics or gender wars or anything except what actually happened. How she became a symbol instead of a person. How every day she had to wake up and decide whether fighting was worth the cost. Is there a point to this story? Vesper's voice came out harder than she intended. Yeah, the point is that you're not my sister. You're not going to let them destroy you. Because if you do, every other woman who wants to fly fighters is going to have to fight the same battle. And that's not fair, but it's reality. So I'm supposed to be what? A symbol, a martyr for the cause. No, you're supposed to be Captain Vesper Calloway, call sign Revenant, one of the finest fighter pilots I've ever flown with. And when this is over, however it ends, you're supposed to still be flying. Because that's what Revenants do. They come back. The words settled between them. Outside, evening colors were fading to night. Chen stood, started to leave, then paused at the end of the pew. We're flying together tomorrow, 600 brief, don't be late. Wouldn't dream of it. He left. The chapel fell silent again, but somehow the silence felt different now. Less oppressive, more like the calm before a storm, which was appropriate because Vesper could feel the storm building. Not just the investigation and its aftermath, but something larger. A reckoning that had been delayed too long, that had been building throughout her career and maybe her entire life. The moment when all the compromises and accommodations and careful navigation of institutional politics would finally give way to something more honest, more direct. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she was going to find out. The next morning's brief was professional but tense. Colonel Thorne's absence loomed over the room like a ghost, unmentioned but impossible to ignore. The operations officer running the brief was a major named Harrison who'd always struck Vesper as competent but unremarkable. He stuck to the facts, weather threats, training objectives, and avoided anything that might be construed as commentary on recent events. Vesper and Chen were leading a four-ship again, this time with two different wingmen. Both male, both experienced, both professional in a way that suggested they'd been carefully selected. No room for personality conflicts or subtle undermining. Just solid pilots who would execute the mission and maintain formation discipline. It was probably intentional. Someone higher up the chain making sure today's sortie went smoothly. The mission itself was more complex than yesterday's. They'd be flying against aggressor F-16s again, but this time with added complications, simulated surface-to-air threats, electronic warfare jamming, a contested airspace scenario that more closely mimicked actual combat conditions. The kind of training that separated good pilots from great ones. That revealed weaknesses in technique, decision-making, crew coordination. Vesper had run scenarios like this dozens of times, but never with quite this much institutional attention focused on her performance. Pre-flight was routine. Rivera's crew had her aircraft ready, systems green across the board. The walk-around revealed nothing unusual, weapon stations empty but configured for training loads, external fuel tanks properly attached, every panel and access door secure. The F-35 was a maintenance-intensive aircraft, requiring hours of work for every hour of flight, but when it was working properly, it was the most capable fighter jet ever built. Vesper trusted the maintainers to do their jobs. They trusted her to fly their aircraft properly. It was a relationship built on mutual competence and respect. Launch was clean. The four-ship taxied in sequence, ran final checks, then took the runway at precise intervals. Vesper's takeoff roll was smooth, rotation exactly on speed, gear coming up as she climbed out over the Nevada desert. Chen fell into formation off her right wing, the other two pilots stacking up behind. Four F-35s in tactical spread, climbing through scattered clouds toward the operating area where aggressors and simulated threats waited. Radio discipline was perfect. Terse, professional calls confirming positions and status. The controller working their sector cleared them to proceed, his voice carrying the same mix of boredom and focus that characterized people who did the same job thousands of times until it became muscle memory. Everything nominal, everything routine. Except it wasn't routine at all, because somewhere in the chain of command people were watching this sortie more carefully than usual, waiting to see if the pilot who'd been assaulted yesterday could still perform today. She could. The engagement unfolded with mechanical precision. When the aggressors made their initial move, Vesper had already positioned her flight to counter it. When electronic warfare jamming degraded their situational awareness, she'd anticipated the effect and had backup procedures ready. When one of her wingmen got fixated on a bandit and started drifting out of position, she corrected him with a single terse call that brought him back into formation without making him feel incompetent. By the time the exercise ended, her flight had achieved every training objective and dominated the aggressors in a way that probably felt embarrassing for pilots who prided themselves on being the bad guys everyone else trained against. The aggressor lead's voice on the radio was tight with frustration poorly concealed as professional courtesy. "Solid work, Revenant Flight. You've obviously done this before." "It's why they pay us the big bucks," Vesper replied, and allowed herself a smile that nobody could see inside her helmet. The mission had gone well, better than well, and she'd done it while carrying emotional weight that would have grounded lesser pilots. That had to count for something. Recovery was equally clean. 4 aircraft in sequence, each landing exactly on centerline, exactly on speed, exactly where they should. No drama, no mistakes. Just competent execution of basic flight procedures that every pilot learned but not every pilot mastered. Vesper taxied to her parking spot, shut down the systems in proper order, and climbed out to find not just Rivera waiting but also Colonel Whitmore. The vice commander's presence at the flight line was even more unusual than yesterday. Senior officers had better things to do than watch individual pilots climb out of cockpits, but Whitmore didn't look like she was there for casual observation. Her expression was serious, unreadable behind aviator sunglasses that reflected the morning sun in ways that made it impossible to see her eyes. "Captain Calloway, walk with me." Not a request. Vesper fell into step beside the colonel, still wearing her flight gear, helmet tucked under one arm. They walked away from the flight line, away from the noise of aircraft and maintainers and the bustle of normal operations, toward a quiet corner of the ramp where they could talk without being overheard. "How are you holding up?" Whitmore asked when they were alone. "Fine, ma'am. Mission went well." "That's not what I asked." Vesper considered lying, decided against it. "I'm managing, ma'am, focused on the flying, everything else is background noise." "Background noise that's getting louder. The Inspector General is sending a team. They'll be here next week to conduct a formal investigation. You'll be interviewed again. So will everyone who witnessed the incident. It's going to get uncomfortable." "Understood." "I don't think you do." Whitmore finally removed her sunglasses, and her eyes were as hard as Vesper had expected. "This isn't just about you and Colonel Thorne anymore. This is about whether the Air Force can be trusted to police its own, whether women are safe in uniform, whether decades of training and policy and cultural change have actually meant anything. The media is already circling. Congress is asking questions. You've become a test case whether you wanted to be or not." "I didn't ask for any of this, ma'am." "No, but you're stuck with it anyway. So here's what I need from you. Keep flying. Keep being excellent. Don't give anyone any reason to question your competence or your judgment, because the people who don't want this investigation to go forward are going to look for any excuse to discredit you, and the smallest mistake will be magnified into proof that you're the problem, not Colonel Thorne. The unfairness of it settled on Vesper's shoulders like physical weight. She had to be perfect while her assailant just had to be sympathetic, had to fly flawlessly while carrying emotional trauma that would ground most people, had to smile and be professional while internal politics decided whether justice mattered more than institutional convenience. Is that all, ma'am? No, Whitmore stepped closer, voice dropping. I want you to know that I'm on your side. Not everyone in the chain of command is, but I am. What Colonel Thorne did was unacceptable, and he's going to face consequences.